The coffee mug slipped from Alina's trembling fingers, shattering against the marble floor of the Pinnacle Technologies executive conference room. 23 pairs of eyes turned toward her, some with barely concealed smirks, others with the careful neutrality of corporate politeness. The ceramic fragments scattered like her composure, dark liquid spreading across the pristine white stone in an abstract pattern that seemed to mirror the chaos erupting in her chest. "Congratulations, Miss Chen," Richard Hawthorne's voice cut through the silence, his tone carrying the weight of inevitability. The silver-haired CEO of Meridian Industries stood at the head of the mahogany table, his hands folded behind his back, watching her with eyes that held secrets she couldn't yet fathom. "As of Monday morning, you'll be assuming the role of Regional Director for the newly merged Pacific Division." 6 months ago, at the annual Pinnacle Technologies retreat in the Catskill Mountains, Alina had stood before this same group of colleagues during what was supposed to be a lighthearted award ceremony. The lodge's great room had been warm with artificial camaraderie, the scent of pine logs crackling in the massive stone fireplace, mixing with the aroma of mulled wine and nervous laughter. She remembered the weight of the cheap plastic trophy they'd handed her, its gold paint already chipping around the edges, the words "most likely to be fired" etched in Comic Sans font across a miniature pink slip. They had all laughed then. Even Alina had managed a weak smile, accepting the joke award with the grace expected of someone who understood her place in the company hierarchy. She was the quiet one, the methodical analyst, who questioned too many decisions, who stayed late to triple-check reports that others would have rubber-stamped hours earlier. She was the woman who brought homemade cookies to office birthdays, but was rarely invited to the after-work drinks where real networking happened. Marcus Webb had presented the award with his characteristic blend of charm and cruelty, his perfectly styled hair catching the firelight as he delivered his acceptance speech on her behalf. Our dear Alina, always so concerned with the little details, so worried about following every rule to the letter. Some might say she's too cautious for the fast-paced world of modern business. The laughter that followed had felt like small knives finding their mark. Now Marcus sat 3 seats to her left, his usually confident expression replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic. His manicured fingers drummed against the table surface in an uncharacteristic display of nerves, the sound barely audible above the hum of the building's climate control system. The man who had climbed the corporate ladder with ruthless efficiency, who had secured 3 major promotions in 5 years through a combination of aggressive salesmanship and strategic alliance building, was staring at his reflection in the polished wood as if he no longer recognized himself. Sarah Martinez, the company's former rising star, had gone completely still. Her designer blazer, the one she'd bought specifically for today's merger announcement meeting, seemed to hang differently on her shoulders now, as if the fabric itself understood that the rules of the game had fundamentally changed. Sarah had been everyone's pick for the next big promotion. The MBA graduate with the killer instinct and the networking skills that opened doors across 3 time zones. She had mentored junior staff with the calculated kindness of someone building a reputation, had volunteered for every high-visibility project with the strategic thinking of a chess grandmaster. The conference room itself seemed to hold its breath, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the Seattle skyline that stretched beyond Elliott Bay to the Olympic Mountains in the distance. On clear days, you could see Mount Rainier from here, its snow-capped peak a reminder of permanence in a world of constant corporate flux. Today, however, a low layer of clouds obscured the horizon, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty that seemed fitting for the moment at hand. Alina's mind raced backward to the series of events that had led to this impossible reversal of fortune. 3 weeks ago, rumors had begun circulating through the office about a potential merger, whispers that grew louder in the break rooms and quieter in the elevators. Pinnacle Technologies, despite its impressive quarterly reports and sleek downtown headquarters, had been hemorrhaging clients to more agile competitors. The writing was on the wall for months, visible to anyone who cared to look past the cheerful corporate communications about exciting new opportunities and strategic realignments.
Most of her colleagues had responded to the uncertainty with increased political maneuvering, forming alliances and positioning themselves for whatever changes might come. Office conversations had taken on the careful tone of people walking through a minefield, each word chosen for its potential to either advance or damage one's standing in the invisible hierarchy that governed their professional lives. But Alina had done what she always did. She had buried herself in her work. While others spent their lunch hours in hushed strategy sessions, she had continued her meticulous analysis of client retention patterns, market trends, and operational inefficiencies. Her reports had grown more detailed, her recommendations more comprehensive, her late nights at the office more frequent. She had approached the merger rumors with the same methodical attention she brought to everything else, treating uncertainty as just another variable to be quantified and understood. The irony wasn't lost on her now. The very qualities that had made her colleagues see her as expendable, her attention to detail, her reluctance to cut corners, her insistence on thorough analysis over quick wins, had apparently caught the attention of people who mattered in ways she couldn't have imagined. Richard Hawthorne moved around the table with the measured pace of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. At 62, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from 4 decades of making decisions that shaped industries. His reputation preceded him into every meeting, the man who had turned 3 failing companies into market leaders, who had navigated economic downturns with the strategic brilliance of a wartime general, who commanded respect through competency rather than charisma. The merger between Pinnacle and Meridian represents more than just a combination of resources. It's an opportunity to build something that neither company could achieve alone. But success will depend entirely on leadership, not just at the executive level, but throughout the organization. Alina felt the weight of his gaze as it settled on her again, and she fought the urge to look away. There was something in his expression that suggested this moment had been planned, that her presence here wasn't the accident she had assumed it to be. The realization sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the building's aggressive air conditioning. Ms. Chen, Hawthorne said, and the formality of his address seemed to create additional distance between her and her soon-to-be former peers. Your analysis of the Pacific region's operational challenges was illuminating. Your recommendations for resettling client services, improving efficiency metrics, and reducing overhead costs caught the attention of our transition team. More importantly, your track record of ethical decision-making and attention to regulatory compliance makes you an ideal candidate for leadership in our newly merged organization. The silence that followed his words was pregnant with implications. Alina could feel the shift in the room's dynamic, the way 23 other professionals were suddenly recalculating their assumptions about her competence, her connections, her future value to the organization. She thought about the countless meetings where her contributions had been dismissed with polite nods, the strategic discussions where her input had been overlooked in favor of more aggressive voices, the performance reviews where she had been praised for her reliability but passed over for advancement because she lacked the executive presence that the company valued. Marcus cleared his throat, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Richard, if I may," he began, his sales-trained voice carrying a note of desperation disguised as professional courtesy. "I think there might be some confusion about the leadership structure in the Pacific region. My team has been developing relationships with key clients there for over 2 years, and I've already initiated several strategic partnerships that could be compromised if there's a sudden change in oversight." Hawthorne's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness suggested that Marcus had just made a significant tactical error. "Mr. Webb, your relationship-building efforts are exactly why this transition is necessary. Our due diligence process revealed some interesting patterns in your client management approach. Ms. Chen's forensic analysis of the Pacific region's operational challenges, accounts receivable, identified several practices that, while perhaps not technically fraudulent, certainly raise questions about long-term sustainability and ethical compliance." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Alina remembered the late nights she had spent poring over spreadsheets that didn't quite balance, the expense reports that followed patterns too convenient to be coincidental, the client contracts with terms that seemed designed to benefit short-term commission structures rather than long-term relationship building. She had documented everything with her characteristic thoroughness, never imagining that her detailed reports would serve as evidence in what was apparently a much larger corporate investigation. Sarah's voice broke the tension, though her attempt at maintaining her composure was visible in the slight tremor that accompanied her words. "Mr. Hawthorne, I appreciate the confidence you're showing in Alina, but I think we need to consider the practical implications of this decision.
The Pacific region requires someone with established client relationships and proven leadership experience. Alina is undoubtedly competent in her analytical role, but managing a regional division involves skills that simply can't be learned overnight. The condescension in Sarah's tone was subtle but unmistakable, the kind of professional dismissal that Alina had endured countless times over the years. It was delivered with a smile, wrapped in the language of constructive feedback, designed to sound reasonable to anyone who wasn't on the receiving end. But today, something had changed. Today, the words seemed to bounce off an invisible shield that Alina hadn't known she possessed. Hawthorne's response was measured and final. Miss Martinez, our evaluation process was comprehensive. Miss Chen's leadership capabilities may not have been fully utilized in her previous role, but her approach to problem-solving, her ethical standards, and her deep understanding of operational efficiency make her uniquely qualified for the challenges ahead. The Pacific region needs someone who understands that sustainable growth comes from building systems, not just relationships. As the meeting continued around her, Alina found herself studying the faces of her colleagues with new eyes. These were the people who had shared coffee machine conversations about weekend plans, who had commiserated about difficult clients and impossible deadlines, who had formed the backdrop of her professional life for the past 7 years. Now, they were looking at her as if she were a stranger, someone whose true nature had been hidden behind a carefully constructed facade of mediocrity. The plastic trophy from the company retreat sat on her desk back in her small office on the 15th floor, a daily reminder of her colleagues' expectations and her own perceived limitations. She had kept it there not out of nostalgia, but as motivation, a tangible representation of the gap between how others saw her and how she hoped to prove herself. She had never imagined that the proof would come in the form of a corporate merger that would transform her from the office's most likely casualty into its most surprising success story. But as she looked around the conference room, taking in the carefully controlled expressions and the undercurrent of panic that seemed to flow beneath the surface of professional courtesy, Alina realized that her real challenges were just beginning. The merger announcement had given her power, but power without respect was just authority waiting to be undermined. The same people who had voted her most likely to be fired were now going to be working under her leadership, and she had no illusions about how they would receive that transition. The meeting was drawing to a close, with Hawthorne outlining the timeline for the merger's implementation and the various transition procedures that would need to be completed over the coming weeks. But Alina found herself thinking about the deeper implications of this moment, about the ways that corporate life could shift with the suddenness of an earthquake, revealing foundations that had been invisible moments before. As her colleagues began gathering their materials and preparing to leave, she caught a reflection in the conference room's windows. The woman looking back at her was the same person who had walked into the meeting 30 minutes earlier, but something fundamental had changed. The uncertain expression was still there, the rumpled blouse that suggested someone more concerned with substance than style, the practical shoes chosen for comfort rather than impression. But there was something else now, something in her posture that suggested she was beginning to understand the magnitude of the opportunity that had just been placed in her hands.
The question that hung in the air as the meeting ended wasn't whether she was qualified for the promotion. Hawthorne's confidence had settled that issue, at least temporarily. The real question was whether she was prepared for the inevitable campaign that would be waged against her leadership, the subtle and not-so-subtle attempts to undermine her authority, and the challenge of transforming a dysfunctional regional division while managing the expectations of people who had never taken her seriously before. As the last of her colleagues filed out of the conference room, their hushed conversations already beginning in the hallway beyond, Alina remained in her chair, staring at the broken coffee mug that no one had bothered to clean up. The ceramic fragments caught the light from the windows, creating small prisms that scattered rainbow reflections across the marble floor. It seemed like a metaphor for something, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt longer than usual, the silence broken only by the mechanical hum of cables and pulleys that seemed to echo the uncertainty churning in Alina's chest. She had made this journey hundreds of times before, but today the familiar ritual felt like crossing a threshold into unknown territory. The numbers on the digital display clicked upward with methodical precision. 7, 8, 9. each floor marking another second of delay before she would have to face the reality of what had just happened in that conference room. When the doors finally opened, the familiar sights and sounds of the Pinnacle Technologies office space greeted her with unchanged normalcy. The reception desk still held the same arrangement of artificial flowers that had been there for 3 years, their plastic petals gathering dust that the cleaning crew somehow never quite managed to eliminate. The motivational posters still decorated the walls with their cheerful slogans about teamwork and excellence, their bright colors and bold fonts creating an atmosphere of enforced optimism that had always struck Alina as slightly desperate. Her corner office, a modest space that had been a source of quiet pride when she'd earned it 2 years ago, now felt like a sanctuary under siege. The nameplate on her door still read Alina Chen, Senior Financial Analyst, but those words already felt like artifacts from a previous era. By Monday morning, that title would be replaced with something that carried weight she wasn't sure she was prepared to bear. The plastic trophy sat exactly where she had left it that morning, occupying a prominent position on her desk between a photograph of her parents and a small succulent plant that had somehow managed to thrive despite her sporadic attention to its care. Most likely to be fired. The words seemed to mock her now, not because they had proven false, but because they represented a version of herself that she had accepted as immutable truth. Alina sank into her desk chair, a piece of ergonomic furniture that had never quite adjusted properly to her 5'4" frame, and stared at the trophy with new eyes. She remembered the night she had brought it home to her small apartment in Belltown, how she had placed it on her kitchen counter while she prepared a dinner of leftover takeout and tried to process the humiliation of being singled out as the office's most expendable employee. Her cat, Mochi, had investigated the new addition with typical feline curiosity before dismissing it as unworthy of further attention. That night, she had called her mother in Portland, as she did every Sunday evening, and had mentioned the retreat in passing. Margaret Chen, a woman who had immigrated to the United States at age 23 with nothing but a nursing degree and an unshakable belief in the power of hard work, had listened to her daughter's careful recounting of the weekend's events with the kind of silence that suggested she was hearing more than just words. "Alina," her mother had said finally, her accent still carrying traces of the Mandarin that had been her first language, "sometimes people need to make themselves feel bigger by making others feel smaller. This says nothing about you and everything about them, but what you do next, that will say something about you." The conversation had ended with the usual exchange of health updates and promises to visit soon, but her mother's words had stayed with her through the months that followed. They had echoed in her mind during the late nights when she stayed at the office to finish projects that could have waited until morning, when she double-checked calculations that her colleagues would have considered sufficient after a single review, when she researched industry trends and regulatory changes that might affect their clients months or years in the future. Now, sitting in her office with the Seattle afternoon light filtering through windows that needed cleaning, Alina found herself thinking about the patterns that had shaped her professional life. She had always been the one who arrived early and left late, not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because incomplete work felt like a physical discomfort she couldn't ignore. While her colleagues discussed their weekend plans over coffee, she would be reviewing quarterly reports, looking for discrepancies that might indicate larger problems. Her approach to office relationships had been similarly methodical. She had never been the type to network aggressively or position herself strategically in conversations. Instead, she had tried to be genuinely helpful, offering to assist with projects that weren't technically her responsibility, sharing research that might be useful to other departments, remembering birthdays and work anniversaries when others forgot. She had operated under the assumption that competence and kindness would eventually be recognized and rewarded. The assumption had proven partially correct, though not in the way she had expected. Her competence had indeed been noticed, but by people she hadn't realized were watching.
Her detailed analysis of the Pacific region's operations, conducted during what she had thought were routine quarterly reviews, had apparently painted a picture of systemic problems that went far deeper than anyone had suspected. Her recommendations for addressing those problems, suggestions she had made tentatively, expecting them to be filed away and forgotten, had instead formed the foundation for a restructuring plan that would affect hundreds of employees across multiple states. The irony was overwhelming. For years, she had watched colleagues like Marcus Webb and Sarah Martinez navigate the corporate landscape with apparent ease, building alliances and accumulating influence with the strategic thinking of generals planning a campaign. They had seemed to understand intuitively how to position themselves for advancement, how to take credit for successes and deflect responsibility for failures, how to make themselves indispensable to the people who made decisions about promotions and salary increases. Marcus, in particular, had mastered the art of relationship-based selling. His office walls were covered with photographs of himself at industry conferences, shaking hands with clients at expensive restaurants, participating in charity golf tournaments that served as networking opportunities. He had cultivated an image of success that attracted more success, creating a feedback loop that had propelled him through multiple promotions in record time. But now, sitting in the aftermath of the merger announcement, Alina was beginning to understand that there had been two different games being played simultaneously. While Marcus and Sarah had been focused on the visible competition for advancement within Pinnacle Technologies, a larger evaluation had been taking place behind the scenes. Meridian Industries had been conducting their own assessment of Pinnacle's personnel, and they had been looking for different qualities than the ones that had traditionally been rewarded in the company's internal hierarchy. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. Everything she had been told about corporate success, the importance of visibility, the need to self-promote, the value of strategic relationships, had suddenly been revealed as incomplete at best. The qualities that had made her colleagues see her as a supporting player in their career narratives had apparently made her a leading candidate for actual leadership in the eyes of people who understood the difference. Alina pulled her laptop toward her and opened the file containing her analysis of the Pacific region's operations. The document was over 40 pages long, filled with charts and graphs and detailed explanations of efficiency metrics that most people would have summarized in a few bullet points. She had spent weeks compiling the data, cross-referencing client accounts with expense reports, tracking patterns in contract renewals and customer satisfaction scores. The work had been tedious and time-consuming, the kind of deep-dive analysis that rarely received recognition because it happened far from the spotlight of quarterly presentations and client meetings. But as she scrolled through the document now, she could see it with fresh perspective. This wasn't just a report. It was a blueprint for transformation. Her recommendations weren't just suggestions. They were the foundation for a new approach to regional management that prioritized sustainable growth over short-term gains. The data she had collected wasn't just numbers. It was evidence of systemic problems that had been hiding in plain sight while everyone focused on surface-level performance metrics. The Pacific region's client retention rates had been declining steadily for 18 months, disguised by aggressive new client acquisition that created the illusion of growth. Expense reports showed patterns of entertainment and travel costs that seemed designed more to benefit the sales team than to serve client needs. Contract terms had been structured to maximize immediate commissions rather than long-term relationship value, creating a churn and burn approach that was fundamentally unsustainable. Marcus had been the primary architect of this approach, though he had never presented it in such stark terms. His quarterly presentations had focused on growth percentages and revenue figures, glossing over the underlying trends that suggested the success was temporary.
His relationship-building efforts had been real, but they had been built on a foundation of practices that prioritized his own advancement over the long-term health of the division. Alina had documented all of this with characteristic thoroughness, not because she was trying to undermine anyone's career, but because the patterns were impossible to ignore once you started looking for them. Her analysis had been clinical and objective, focused on identifying problems rather than assigning blame, but the implications were clear. The Pacific region was heading for a crisis that would affect not just Pinnacle's bottom line, but the job security of dozens of employees who had no idea their positions were at risk. Now, she was going to be responsible for fixing those problems, managing the transition that would inevitably involve difficult conversations and unpopular decisions. Some of the people who had voted her most likely to be fired were going to discover that their own positions were in jeopardy, not because of her vindictiveness, but because the practices they had relied on were unsustainable. The thought should have been satisfying, but instead it filled her with a sense of overwhelming responsibility. These weren't just colleagues who had underestimated her. They were people with mortgages and families, career aspirations, and financial obligations. The decisions she made as regional director would affect their lives in ways that went far beyond office politics and professional hierarchies. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her friend Jennifer, a software engineer at a startup downtown who had been her closest confidant through the ups and downs of corporate life. "How did the big meeting go? Still employed? Wine tonight?" Alina stared at the message, unsure how to respond. 6 hours ago, she would have texted back with a resigned emoji and a joke about updating her LinkedIn profile. Now she was facing the prospect of leading a regional division through a complex merger while managing the expectations of people who had never taken her seriously. The transformation felt so sudden and dramatic that she wondered if she was experiencing some kind of elaborate stress-induced hallucination. She typed back, "Still employed. More than employed. Call you later. Need to process." Jennifer's response was immediate. "Mysterious. Good mysterious or bad mysterious?" "Complicated mysterious," then put her phone aside to avoid further questions she wasn't ready to answer. The afternoon stretched ahead of her with the weight of anticipation. In a few hours, news of the merger and the leadership changes would begin spreading through the office grapevine. By tomorrow, everyone would know about her promotion, and the speculation would begin in earnest. She could imagine the conversations that would take place in the break rooms and elevators, the theories that would be developed to explain how someone like her had managed to leapfrog over more obvious candidates. Some of the speculation would be generous, attributing her success to hidden competencies that had finally been recognized. But she knew there would also be darker theories, suggestions that she had somehow manipulated the situation through connections or information that others didn't possess. The idea of being seen as scheming or political was almost as uncomfortable as being seen as incompetent, perhaps more so. The truth was more prosaic and more challenging than either interpretation. She had been promoted not because she had played the corporate game better than her colleagues, but because she had been playing a different game entirely.
Improving the system itself. The merger had simply revealed which approach was more valuable to the people who would be shaping the company's future. But understanding the logic behind her promotion didn't make the transition any less daunting. In 3 days, she would be responsible for a division that included 5 major cities, over 200 employees, and millions of dollars in annual revenue. She would be managing people who had previously been her peers, implementing changes that would affect the careers and livelihoods of colleagues who had never considered her a threat to their own advancement. The plastic trophy caught the light from her desk lamp, its cheap gold plating reflecting a distorted version of her office ceiling. 6 months ago, it had represented the limits of her colleagues' expectations for her career trajectory. Now it served as a reminder of how quickly fundamental assumptions could be overturned by changing circumstances. Alina picked up the trophy and held it in her hands, feeling the weight of its hollow construction and the rough edges where the plastic molding had been imperfectly finished. Tomorrow, she would probably remove it from her desk, packing it away as an artifact from a previous chapter of her career. But today, it seemed important to acknowledge what it represented. Not just her colleagues' low expectations, but her own willingness to accept those limitations as immutable truth. The realization was uncomfortable, but necessary. For years, she had allowed other people's perceptions to define the boundaries of her professional ambitions. She had internalized their assumptions about her capabilities and adjusted her goals accordingly. The promotion wasn't just an opportunity to lead a regional division, it was an opportunity to discover what she might accomplish when those artificial limitations were removed. As the afternoon light began to fade outside her office windows, Alina made a decision that felt both momentous and practical. She would keep the trophy, but she would move it to a less prominent position. It would serve as a reminder not of her colleagues' limitations, but of her own capacity for growth beyond the expectations that had previously defined her professional identity. The transformation from most likely to be fired to regional director was just the beginning. The real challenge would be proving to herself and to the people she would be leading that the promotion was based on genuine capability rather than corporate accident. That would require not just competence, but courage, and she was about to discover which qualities she possessed in greater measure. The first sign of organized resistance came on Thursday morning, disguised as concern for company morale. Alina arrived at the office to find Sarah Martinez waiting beside her door, holding 2 cups of coffee, and wearing the kind of sympathetic expression that could mean either genuine friendship or calculated strategy. After 7 years of navigating office politics, Alina had learned to recognize the difference, though this particular performance was more subtle than most. "I thought you might need some caffeine," Sarah said, extending one of the cups with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yesterday must have been overwhelming. I can't imagine how it feels to have so much responsibility suddenly dropped in your lap." The words were carefully chosen, designed to sound supportive while reinforcing the narrative that Alina's promotion was an accident of circumstance rather than a recognition of merit. It was the kind of verbal maneuvering that Sarah had perfected over years of corporate advancement, a technique that allowed her to undermine competitors while maintaining plausible deniability about her intentions. Alina accepted the coffee with genuine gratitude, despite recognizing the subtext. "Thank you. It's definitely going to be an adjustment, but I'm looking forward to the challenge." She unlocked her office door and gestured for Sarah to follow her inside, curious about what would come next in this carefully choreographed conversation. Sarah settled into the visitor's chair with practiced ease, crossing her legs and leaning forward with the body language of someone preparing to share confidential information. There's been a lot of talk since yesterday's announcement. People are confused, I guess is the best way to put it. They're trying to understand the decision-making process behind the leadership changes.
The euphemism was transparent enough to be almost insulting. Confused clearly meant angry or resentful, but Sarah was too sophisticated to express such emotions directly. Instead, she was positioning herself as Alina's ally, someone willing to share intelligence about the brewing rebellion in exchange for future consideration when the new power structure inevitably collapsed. "I imagine there would be questions," Alina replied carefully. "Change is always unsettling, especially when it happens quickly. But Meridian's decision was based on comprehensive analysis of the Pacific region's needs and my track record of addressing operational challenges." Sarah's smile became more genuine, suggesting that Alina had just provided the opening she had been hoping for. "Of course, and no one is questioning your analytical skills. You've always been incredibly thorough in your work. But analysis and leadership are 2 very different skill sets, and some people are wondering whether the transition team fully considered the practical implications of their decision." The conversation was beginning to feel like a chess match, each statement serving as both move and countermove in a game whose ultimate objective remained unclear. Alina sipped her coffee, which was excellent, probably from the expensive cafe across the street rather than the office machine, and considered her response carefully. I appreciate your concern, Sarah, but I'm confident that Meridian's evaluation process was thorough. They wouldn't have made this decision lately, especially given what's at stake with the merger. Sarah's smile became more genuine, as if Alina had just provided the opening she had been hoping for. Of course, and no one is questioning your analytical skills. You've always been incredibly thorough in your work. But analysis and leadership are two very different skill sets, and some people are wondering whether the transition team fully considered the practical implications of their decision. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah was essentially warning Alina that her authority would be undermined unless she took steps to address the concerns that were supposedly circulating among the staff. It was a classic power play, designed to force the new leader into a defensive position while positioning Sarah as an indispensable ally who could help navigate the political minefield. But Alina had spent too many years observing these dynamics from the periphery to be easily manipulated by them. I understand your point about perception, she said. That's why I'm planning to meet individually with each of the senior team members over the next few weeks. I want to hear their perspectives directly and address any concerns they might have about the transition. Sarah's expression flickered almost imperceptibly, suggesting that this response had caught her off guard. She had probably expected Alina to ask for her help in managing the team's resistance, creating an opportunity to position herself as a power broker in the new regime. Instead, Alina was asserting direct authority over the process, eliminating Sarah's potential role as intermediary. "That's a great approach," Sarah said, recovering quickly. "I'm sure everyone will appreciate the opportunity to share their thoughts. In fact, I was hoping we could schedule some time to discuss my own role in the transition. I've been developing several strategic initiatives that could really benefit from your analytical perspective." The pivot was smoothly executed, but transparent in its intent. Having failed to establish herself as Alina's informal advisor, Sarah was now attempting to secure a formal position of influence within the new structure. It was the kind of political maneuvering that had served her well in previous reorganizations, but it revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how the power dynamics had shifted. "I'd be happy to review any proposals you'd like to submit, but I should mention that all strategic initiatives will need to align with the operational efficiency goals that Meridian has established for the division. The days of pursuing growth at any cost are over." The statement was delivered mildly, but its implications were devastating. Sarah's career advancement had been built largely on her ability to secure high-profile clients and generate impressive revenue figures, often through aggressive tactics that prioritized short-term gains.
Over long-term sustainability, Alina's emphasis on efficiency and alignment suggested that those tactics would no longer be valued, potentially undermining Sarah's position within the division. Sarah's response was carefully controlled, but Alina could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. "Of course, efficiency has always been important. I'm sure we can find ways to maintain our growth trajectory while optimizing our operational processes." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Sarah probing for information about Alina's plans and priorities, while simultaneously attempting to position herself as an essential part of the transition. But the dynamic had been established. Alina was not going to be intimidated into sharing authority, and Sarah's traditional influence tactics were not going to work in the new environment. After Sarah left, Alina spent the morning reviewing personnel files and organizational charts, preparing for the individual meetings she had promised. The Pacific Division included 47 employees across 5 offices, ranging from entry-level analysts to senior account managers who had been with the company for over a decade. Each file told a story of career progression, performance evaluations, and salary negotiations that collectively painted a picture of the division's culture and priorities. Marcus Webb's file was particularly illuminating. His performance reviews consistently praised his client relationship skills and revenue generation, but they also included subtle notes about his tendency to overpromise deliverables and his resistance to internal process improvements. One evaluation from 2 years ago mentioned concerns about his expense reporting practices, though the issue had apparently been resolved through what the file euphemistically described as additional training and oversight. The lunch hour brought the first open challenge to Alina's authority, delivered with the kind of theatrical flair that suggested it had been carefully planned for maximum impact. She was sitting in the break room, eating a salad she had brought from home while reviewing quarterly reports when Marcus approached her table with a group of 3 other senior staff members in tow. "Alina," he said, loud enough for everyone in the break room to hear, "I was hoping we could discuss the transition timeline. Some of my clients have been asking questions about the leadership changes, and I want to make sure I'm giving them accurate information." The phrasing was designed to create pressure while maintaining professional courtesy. By mentioning client concerns in a public setting, Marcus was forcing Alina to address his questions immediately or risk appearing unresponsive to customer needs. It was the kind of power play that relied on social dynamics and group psychology to achieve its effect. "I'd be happy to discuss that with you. Why don't we schedule a meeting this afternoon so we can go through all the details properly?" Marcus's smile became more aggressive, suggesting that her attempt to move the conversation to a private setting had been anticipated and countered. "Actually, I think it would be helpful for everyone to hear this, since we're all going to be affected by the changes. My clients are specifically concerned about continuity of service and whether their existing relationships will be honored under the new structure." The question was loaded with implications. Marcus was essentially challenging Alina to publicly commit to maintaining his client relationships and decision-making authority, or risk appearing to disrupt established business operations. The 3 colleagues flanking him, Jennifer Walsh from account management, David Kim from business development, and Patricia Flores from client services, watched the exchange with expressions that ranged from curious to openly hostile. Alina set down her fork and looked directly at Marcus, her voice carrying the quiet authority that she was still learning to project. Client continuity is absolutely a priority during this transition. However, all client relationships will be evaluated to ensure they align with our new operational standards and compliance requirements. Any changes to service delivery will be made in consultation with both the clients and the account teams to ensure minimal disruption. The response was diplomatically phrased but strategically devastating. By mentioning operational standards and compliance requirements, Alina was referencing the very issues that her analysis had identified in Marcus's client management approach. She was essentially putting him on notice that his methods would be scrutinized while maintaining the appearance of reasonable business practice. Marcus's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained professionally cordial. "That sounds like a comprehensive review process. How long do you anticipate that taking? Some of my clients have been with us for over 5 years, and they value the personal relationships they've built with our team."
"The review will be completed within 60 days, Alina replied. "Client relationships are indeed valuable, but they need to be built on sustainable practices that serve both the client's interests and the company's long-term objectives. Any relationships that don't meet those criteria will need to be restructured or transitioned." The silence that followed her statement was charged with tension. Everyone in the break room was now listening to the exchange, recognizing it as a defining moment in the new power structure. Marcus had essentially forced a public confrontation, expecting Alina to back down or defer to his experience and established relationships. Instead, she had calmly asserted her authority while making it clear that his position was not as secure as he had assumed. David Kim stepped forward, his usual quiet demeanor replaced by an intensity that suggested he had been designated as backup support for Marcus's challenge. "Alina, I think we need to be realistic about the transition timeline. The business development pipeline I've been building for the past 18 months represents over $12 million in potential revenue. If we start making wholesale changes to our approach, we could lose opportunities that took years to develop." the intervention was more sophisticated than Marcus's direct confrontation, focusing on business impact rather than personal authority. David was positioning himself as the voice of practical concern, someone worried about the company's financial well-being rather than his own job security. But Alina had reviewed his files as well, and she knew that his pipeline included several questionable proposals that relied on aggressive pricing and contract terms that would be difficult to fulfill profitably. David, your work on business development is appreciated, but potential revenue only becomes actual revenue when it's based on realistic projections and sustainable service delivery. Part of my role will be ensuring that we're pursuing opportunities that we can execute successfully rather than commitments that might compromise our ability to serve existing clients. Patricia Flores, who had remained silent during the exchange, finally spoke up with the kind of resigned frustration that suggested she had been pushed into participating against her better judgment. This all sounds like we are going to be starting over from scratch. Some of us have been building our careers here for years, and now we're being told that everything we've accomplished might not meet the new standards. Her statement revealed the deeper fear that was driving the resistance to Alina's leadership, the possibility that years of career advancement based on one set of criteria were about to be invalidated by a completely different evaluation framework. It was a legitimate concern, and one that deserved a more thoughtful response than the political maneuvering that Marcus and David were employing. Alina's voice softened slightly, acknowledging the emotional weight of Patricia's concern while maintaining her authority over the situation. Patricia, I understand your frustration, and I want to be clear that this isn't about invalidating anyone's contributions. The skills and relationships you've all built are valuable assets. But the merger creates an opportunity to build on those assets in ways that create more sustainable success for everyone involved. The response was genuine, but it also served to isolate Marcus and David as the primary sources of resistance, while positioning Patricia as someone whose concerns could be addressed through reasonable dialogue. It was a subtle but effective divide-and-conquer strategy that Alina hadn't consciously planned but found herself executing with surprising competence. Marcus recognized the shift in dynamics and attempted to regain control of the narrative. Of course, we all want sustainable success, but change for the sake of change can be just as dangerous as stagnation. The Pacific region has been one of Pinnacle's most profitable divisions for 3 consecutive years. Maybe we should be asking why something that's working needs to be fixed. The statement was designed to appeal to the broader audience in the break room, many of whom had benefited from the division's apparent success, and might be sympathetic.
Arguments for maintaining the status quo. But it also revealed Marcus's fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. He was still thinking in terms of Pinnacle's internal metrics rather than Meridian's evaluation criteria. Marcus, profitability is important, but it's not the only measure of success, Alina replied. Meridian's analysis identified several areas where our short-term gains were creating long-term vulnerabilities. The goal isn't to change things arbitrarily, but to address those vulnerabilities before they become crisis situations. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Marcus and David making increasingly desperate attempts to undermine Alina's authority, while she systematically dismantled their arguments with references to data and analysis they couldn't challenge without appearing to oppose evidence-based decision-making. By the time the exchange ended, the power dynamics in the room had been clearly established. Alina was in charge, and resistance would be met with professional but decisive responses. As the group dispersed and normal lunch conversations resumed, Alina remained at her table, finishing her salad while processing what had just occurred. The confrontation had been inevitable, but its public nature had served her purposes better than a private meeting might have. By demonstrating her ability to handle challenges with calm authority, she had sent a message to the entire division about her leadership style and expectations. But she also recognized that the resistance was far from over. Marcus and his allies would regroup and develop more sophisticated strategies for undermining her authority. The real test would come when she began implementing the operational changes that her analysis had recommended, changes that would directly affect people's daily routines and performance evaluations. The afternoon brought a series of meetings with division staff, each one providing insight into the complex web of relationships and resentments that had developed over years of internal competition and shifting priorities. Some employees were genuinely enthusiastic about the changes, particularly those who had felt constrained by the previous emphasis on aggressive sales tactics over quality service delivery. Others were openly skeptical, viewing Alina's promotion as a temporary aberration that would be corrected once the merger dust settled. Jennifer Walsh, despite her participation in the luncheon confrontation, proved to be more reasonable in private conversation. She expressed concerns about the transition timeline and the impact on client relationships, but she also acknowledged that some changes were probably necessary. "I'll be honest," she said, "Marcus's approach has been wearing me down for months. The pressure to close deals regardless of whether we can actually deliver what we're promising has been stressful for everyone on the account management team." The admission was revealing, suggesting that Marcus's influence was not as solid as his public confidence implied. Jennifer's willingness to share her frustrations indicated that there were potential allies within the division who had been waiting for someone to challenge the existing power structure. David Kim's meeting was more tense, with him continuing to advocate for his business development pipeline while expressing skepticism about Alina's ability to understand the complexities of client acquisition. "No offense," he said, "but analysis and relationship building are two different skill sets. You can't manage what you haven't done yourself." The criticism was more direct than anything that had been said publicly, but it also revealed David's fundamental weakness. His assumption that Alina lacked practical experience was based on incomplete information about her background and responsibilities. Her analytical work had required extensive client interaction and relationship management, skills that were simply less visible than the theatrical networking that David and Marcus favored. "I understand your concern," Alina replied, "but my analysis of the Pacific region included extensive client interviews and relationship assessment. I've actually spoken with more of our clients in the past 6 months than most account managers have in years. The difference is that I was listening for operational feedback rather than sales opportunities." The response clearly caught David off guard, undermining his assumption about his inexperience while revealing that she had been more actively involved in client relationship management than anyone had realized. It was another example of how her methodical approach to work had generated valuable insights that her colleagues had overlooked because they didn't fit their preconceptions about her role and capabilities.
Patricia Flores's meeting was the most constructive of the day, focusing on practical concerns about service delivery and staff development rather than political maneuvering. She had genuine questions about how the operational changes would affect her team's daily responsibilities, and she seemed relieved to discover that Alina's plans included additional training and support rather than wholesale staff reductions. "I have to admit," Patricia said as their meeting concluded, "I was worried that the new leadership would mean layoffs and budget cuts. It's refreshing to hear someone talking about investing in staff development instead of just cutting costs." The comment highlighted one of the key advantages Alina possessed over her predecessors: her understanding that operational efficiency came from improving systems and supporting staff rather than simply reducing expenses. It was an approach that required more initial investment but generated better long-term results, exactly the kind of strategic thinking that had impressed Meridian's transition team. By the end of the day, Alina had completed meetings with 8 of the division's senior staff members, each conversation adding layers to her understanding of the challenges ahead. The resistance she faced was not monolithic. It ranged from genuine concern about change to calculated political maneuvering to simple fear about job security. Managing the transition would require different strategies for different individuals, a complex balancing act that would test her leadership skills in ways she had never experienced before. As she prepared to leave the office, Alina reflected on the events of the day with a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The confrontation in the break room had been stressful, but it had also demonstrated that she could handle direct challenges to her authority without losing her composure or compromising her principles. The individual meetings had revealed both the depth of the problems she needed to address and the potential for finding allies among staff members who were ready for positive change. The plastic trophy still sat on her desk, but it no longer seemed like a symbol of limitation. Instead, it had become a reminder of how dramatically circumstances could change when underlying assumptions were challenged by new information.
Her colleagues had voted her most likely to be fired because they had based their assessment on visible political maneuvering rather than actual competence. Now, she was in a position to prove that their evaluation criteria had been fundamentally flawed. But as she packed her briefcase and prepared for the weekend ahead, Alina knew that the real challenges were just beginning. The next week would bring the formal announcement of the operational changes, the implementation of new performance metrics, and the inevitable escalation of resistance from those who had the most to lose from the transformation. Her success would depend not just on her analytical skills or her ability to handle confrontation, but on her capacity to inspire genuine change in people who had grown comfortable with the status quo. The plastic trophy still sat on her desk, but it no longer seemed like a symbol of limitation. Instead, it had become a reminder of how dramatically circumstances could change when underlying assumptions were challenged by new information. Her colleagues had voted her most likely to be fired because they had based their assessment on visible political maneuvering rather than actual competence. Now, she was in a position to prove that their evaluation criteria had been fundamentally flawed. But as she packed her briefcase and prepared for the weekend ahead, Alina knew that the real challenges were just beginning. The next week would bring the formal announcement of the operational changes, the implementation of new performance metrics, and the inevitable escalation of resistance from those who had the most to lose from the transformation. Her success would depend not just on her analytical skills or her ability to handle confrontation, but on her capacity to inspire genuine change in people who had grown comfortable with the status quo. The elevator ride to the parking garage felt different than it had that morning, though the mechanical sounds and digital display remained exactly the same. Something fundamental had shifted in her relationship to the office space and the people who occupied it. She was no longer the quiet analyst who stayed late to finish other people's projects. She was the person responsible for determining what projects were worth finishing and who would be doing the work. The transformation was both thrilling and terrifying, and she was beginning to understand that leadership was not just about having the right answers, but about having the courage to implement those answers even when they challenged people's fundamental assumptions about how the world should work. The Monday morning email that would change everything arrived at 6:47 a.m., marked with the red flag that indicated urgent priority. Alina was already at her desk, having arrived early to prepare for what she knew would be a challenging week of implementing the first phase of operational changes. The sender was Richard Hawthorne, and the subject line read simply, Pacific Division Analysis, Confidential Review Required.
Attached to the email was a comprehensive forensic audit report that Meridian's investigators had completed over the weekend. The document was 127 pages of meticulously detailed analysis that painted a picture of systematic misconduct far more extensive than even Alina's thorough research had uncovered. As she read through the findings, her coffee grew cold and her morning planning session transformed into a crash course in corporate crisis management. The audit revealed that Marcus Webb had been manipulating client contracts for over 2 years, structuring deals that generated impressive commission payments while creating service obligations that the company couldn't profitably fulfill. His expense reports, which had raised minor red flags in previous reviews, were actually part of a sophisticated scheme to redirect client entertainment budgets toward personal use. Golf memberships, restaurant bills, and business travel to resort destinations had been systematically misclassified as client development expenses, costing the company an estimated $340,000 over 18 months. David Kim's business development pipeline, which he had defended so aggressively during Thursday's confrontation, included numerous fictitious opportunities created to inflate his performance metrics and justify salary increases. Several potential clients listed in his reports were actually companies that had explicitly declined Pinnacle's services months or years earlier. His projections for $12 million in future revenue were based on proposals that had already been rejected, contracts that had been canceled, and opportunities that existed only in his imagination.
But the most damaging revelation concerned Sarah Martinez, whose strategic initiatives had been funded through a complex web of budget manipulations that diverted resources from essential operational improvements to high-visibility projects that enhanced her reputation without delivering measurable benefits. Her networking events and industry conference presentations had been subsidized by delaying equipment upgrades and staff training that would have improved the division's actual performance. The pattern was clear and devastating. The three senior staff members who had been most critical of Alina's promotion were also the primary sources of the operational problems that had prompted Meridian's intervention. Their resistance to her leadership was not based on legitimate concerns about change management, but on fear that their misconduct would be discovered and addressed. Hawthorne's email included a request for an immediate conference call to discuss the findings and develop an implementation plan for addressing the issues. By 7:30 a.m., Alina found herself in the same conference room where she had learned about her promotion, but this time the atmosphere was charged with the urgency of crisis management rather than the careful choreography of merger announcements. "Ms. Chen," Hawthorne began without preamble, "the audit findings confirm and exceed the concerns that your analysis had identified. We're looking at potential criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement, civil liability for breach of fiduciary duty, and regulatory violations that could affect the entire merger process. How we handle the situation will determine not just the success of the Pacific Division, but the viability of the combined organization." The weight of responsibility was overwhelming, but Alina found herself responding with the same methodical approach that had guided her through previous challenges. "Mr. Hawthorne, I've reviewed the audit report, and I think our first priority needs to be protecting the clients and staff who weren't involved in these activities. We need to separate the misconduct from the operational issues so we can address both problems without creating additional chaos." Hawthorne nodded approvingly. "Exactly. But we also need to consider the legal implications of our response. If we terminate the employees involved without proper documentation and due process, we could face wrongful termination claims that complicate the criminal proceedings. If we don't act quickly enough, we risk additional losses and regulatory sanctions." The conversation continued for over an hour, developing a carefully orchestrated plan for addressing the crisis while protecting the company's legal and financial interests. Alina would conduct individual meetings with each of the implicated employees, presenting them with the audit findings and offering them the opportunity to resign voluntarily rather than face termination and potential criminal prosecution. The process would be documented by legal counsel and human resources representatives to ensure compliance with employment law and regulatory requirements. Meanwhile, Meridian's legal team would be working with federal investigators to determine whether criminal charges were warranted, while the company's insurance providers would be notified about potential claims related to the fraudulent activities. Client contracts would be reviewed to determine which commitments could be honored and which would need to be renegotiated, with priority given to maintaining relationships that served both parties' legitimate interests.
By 9 a.m., Alina was back at her desk, preparing for what would undoubtedly be the most difficult day of her professional career. The evidence against Marcus, David, and Sarah was overwhelming, but presenting it would require diplomatic skills that went far beyond her experience with spreadsheet analysis and operational efficiency. She would need to be simultaneously compassionate and firm, offering them a dignified exit while making it clear that their misconduct was unacceptable and had consequences. The first meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. with Marcus Webb, whose fraudulent expense reports and contract manipulations represented the most straightforward case of misconduct. Alina had requested that Jennifer Walsh from Human Resources and Michael Torres from Legal be present as witnesses, but she would be taking the lead in presenting the findings and managing the conversation. Marcus arrived exactly on time, carrying his usual confident demeanor, but with subtle signs of stress that suggested he was aware something had changed since their confrontation in the break room.
His suit was perfectly pressed, his hair impeccably styled, his smile as practiced as always, but there was a tightness around his eyes that indicated he was operating under more pressure than he was willing to acknowledge. "Alina," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk, as if this were a routine follow-up meeting. "I'm glad we finally have a chance to discuss the transition in more detail. I've been thinking about our conversation last week, and I have some ideas about how we can work together to maintain client relationships while implementing your operational improvements." The performance was impressive in its audacity, suggesting that Marcus was either genuinely unaware of the audit findings or was attempting to brazen his way through a situation he knew was hopeless. Alina had prepared for both possibilities, but his apparent confidence made the coming revelation even more dramatic. "Marcus," she replied, her voice carrying the formal tone that indicated this was not a collaborative discussion. "We need to talk about some serious concerns that have been raised about your client management practices and expense reporting. I'm going to share some information with you, and then we'll discuss your options for responding to these issues." The change in her tone was subtle but unmistakable, causing Marcus's expression to shift from confidence to wariness. He glanced at Jennifer and Michael, seeming to notice their presence for the first time, and his practiced smile became slightly strained. "I'm not sure what you mean by serious concerns," he said carefully. "My performance reviews have been consistently positive, and my client relationships are some of the strongest in the division. If there are specific issues you'd like to discuss, I'm certainly willing to address them." Alina opened the audit report and began reading from the executive summary, her voice steady and professional as she detailed the findings about contract manipulation, fraudulent expense reporting, and systematic misrepresentation of client relationships. With each revelation, Marcus's composure eroded further, his confident facade cracking under the weight of evidence that he couldn't deny or explain away. "These allegations are completely unfounded," he said when she finished, but his voice lacked conviction. "I've always followed policies, and any discrepancies in my reports are administrative errors that can be easily corrected. I'm willing to work with you to resolve any misunderstandings about my client management approach." The denial was expected, but it was delivered with the desperation of someone who knew his situation was hopeless but couldn't bring himself to acknowledge it. Alina had anticipated this response and was prepared to present specific evidence that would make continued denial impossible. "Marcus, let me show you some specific examples," she said, turning her laptop screen toward him. "This is the Meridian Industries contract from last March. According to your commission report, it was a 3-year deal worth $2.8 million. But according to the actual contract on
With legal, it's a 1-year pilot program worth $400,000 with no guarantee of renewal. Can you explain the discrepancy?" The evidence was irrefutable, documented in Marcus's own handwriting and electronic communications that had been preserved in the company's systems. As Alina presented example after example of fraudulent reporting and contract manipulation, Marcus's denials became weaker and more desperate, eventually giving way to attempts at justification and rationalization. "The industry has become incredibly competitive," he said, his voice taking on a pleading quality that was painfully different from his usual smooth confidence. "Everyone is under pressure to show results, to demonstrate value to the company. Sometimes the reporting requirements don't capture the full complexity of client relationships and business development activities." The explanation was a classic deflection strategy, attempting to frame his misconduct as a response to systemic pressures rather than personal choices. But Alina had heard similar justifications during her analysis of operational problems, and she knew that accepting them would undermine any attempt to create genuine accountability. "Marcus, I understand the pressures you're describing, but that doesn't excuse falsifying reports or manipulating client contracts. The evidence shows a pattern of deliberate deception that went on for over 2 years. This isn't about reporting complexity, it's about fraud." The word fraud seemed to hit him like a physical blow, causing him to slump back in his chair as the full implications of the situation became clear. The possibility of criminal charges, civil liability, and career destruction was no longer a distant threat, but an immediate reality that he would have to face.
Jennifer Walsh stepped forward with the paperwork that had been prepared for this moment. A resignation agreement that would allow Marcus to leave the company voluntarily while acknowledging his misconduct and agreeing to cooperate with any future investigations. The alternative, as Michael Torres explained in carefully measured legal language, was immediate termination for cause, potential criminal prosecution, and civil litigation to recover the financial losses his actions had caused. The decision took Marcus less than 5 minutes to make, though the process of signing the document seemed to age him visibly. The confident sales executive who had challenged Alina's authority in the break room was gone, replaced by a defeated man who was finally confronting the consequences of years of shortcuts and ethical compromises. I want you to know, he said as he prepared to leave, this wasn't personal. I never meant for any of this to hurt the company or my colleagues. I just got caught up in the pressure to perform and things spiraled out of control. The apology was probably genuine, but it couldn't undo the damage his actions had caused to client relationships, staff morale, and the division's financial performance. As Alina watched him walk out of her office for the last time, she felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness for the waste of talent and potential, relief that the problem was finally being addressed. The meeting with David Kim followed a similar pattern, though his denials were more sophisticated and his explanations more elaborate. His fictitious business development pipeline was presented as optimistic projections based on preliminary discussions rather than outright fraud. But the evidence was equally damning. Client emails explicitly declining Pinnacle services had been excluded from his reports, while casual conversations at industry events had been inflated into serious business opportunities worth millions of dollars. I was being aggressive in my projections, he admitted when confronted with the discrepancies. But that's what good business development requires. You have to believe in the potential for growth and work toward making it reality. Maybe my timeline was too optimistic, but the opportunities I identified were legitimate. The rationalization was more subtle than Marcus's desperate justifications, but it revealed the same fundamental problem: a willingness to prioritize personal advancement over truthful reporting and ethical business practices. David's elaborate pipeline had been used to justify salary increases and performance bonuses that were based on imaginary achievements rather than actual results.
Sarah Martinez's meeting was the most complex of the three, partly because her misconduct was more sophisticated and partly because her response was more strategic. When presented with evidence of budget manipulation and resource misallocation, she immediately shifted into damage control mode, acknowledging problems while attempting to minimize their significance. I can see how some of my funding decisions might appear questionable in retrospect, she said, her tone carefully modulated to suggest reasonable disagreement rather than guilty acknowledgement. But my strategic initiatives were designed to build long-term value for the division, and sometimes that requires investing in visibility and market positioning rather than just operational efficiency. The explanation was professionally packaged, but fundamentally dishonest. Sarah's strategic initiatives had included expensive networking events that primarily benefited her personal brand, conference presentations that generated impressive publicity but no measurable business results, and industry partnerships that existed mainly on paper. Meanwhile, essential equipment upgrades and staff training had been delayed or canceled to fund these visibility projects. Sarah, the audit found that your initiatives consumed over $200,000 in resources that were diverted from approved operational improvements. Staff members requested training that was denied, equipment failures caused client service delays, and basic infrastructure needs were ignored while you were funding networking events and conference travel. The evidence was particularly damaging because it demonstrated how Sarah's actions had directly harmed other employees and client relationships. Her budget manipulations hadn't just wasted resources for the company, they had prevented necessary improvements that would have benefited the entire division. Like Marcus and David, Sarah ultimately chose resignation over termination,
but her final comments revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what had gone wrong. "I hope you understand," she said as she signed the resignation papers, "that everything I did was intended to benefit the company. Sometimes leadership requires making difficult choices about resource allocation, and maybe my judgment wasn't perfect, but my intentions were good." The statement encapsulated the problem that had led to the crisis: a culture that valued intentions over results, visibility over substance, and personal advancement over collective success. The three employees who had resisted Alina's leadership most aggressively were also the ones who had been most responsible for creating the problems that leadership was meant to address. By the end of the day, Alina had completed the most difficult part of the crisis management process. But she knew that the real work was just beginning. Removing the sources of misconduct was necessary, but not sufficient. She would need to rebuild trust with remaining staff members, renegotiate problematic client contracts, and implement systems that would prevent similar problems from developing in the future. The afternoon brought a series of meetings with employees who had not been implicated in the misconduct, but who were understandably confused and concerned about what the departures meant for their own job security and career prospects. Patricia Flores was among the first to request a meeting. Her usual professional composure replaced a visible anxiety about the implications of the morning's events. "Alina, I have to ask," she said, settling into the visitor's chair that had been occupied by 3 different resignation conversations earlier in the day. "Are there going to be more departures? The rumors are flying, and people are starting to panic about whether their jobs are safe." The question was entirely reasonable, and Alina's response needed to balance transparency with discretion, providing enough information to ease legitimate concerns while protecting the privacy of the investigation and the legal interests of the company. "Patricia, I can tell you that the departures we announced today were related to specific misconduct that affected the division's operations and finances. The investigation is complete, and there are no plans for additional personnel actions related to these issues. Your job is not in jeopardy, and neither are the positions of other staff members who have been doing their work ethically and professionally." The reassurance seemed to reduce Patricia's anxiety, but it also prompted a more complex question about the implications of the revelations for the division's future direction and culture.
"I have to admit," Patricia said, "some of the things that came to light today help explain problems I've been seeing for months. Client complaints that didn't make sense, budget constraints that seemed arbitrary, performance pressures that felt disconnected from actual service quality. I'm wondering if this crisis might actually be an opportunity to address some deeper issues." The observation was perceptive and encouraging, suggesting that at least some staff members were ready to embrace the changes that would be necessary to prevent similar problems from recurring. Patricia's willingness to acknowledge systemic issues rather than simply defending the status quo indicated that she could be an ally in the transformation process. Other meetings throughout the afternoon revealed a range of reactions to the day's events. Some employees expressed shock and disappointment about their former colleagues' misconduct, while others admitted that they had suspected problems but hadn't known how to address them. A few were angry about being kept in the dark about the investigation, feeling that they deserved to know about issues that affected their work environment and professional reputation. Jennifer Walsh proved to be particularly insightful about the cultural factors that had enabled the misconduct to continue for so long. The pressure to show results created an environment where people were rewarded for making impressive claims rather than delivering sustainable outcomes, she said. It became easier to manipulate the reporting than to address the underlying operational challenges. The analysis echoed Alina's own observations about the division's culture, but hearing it from someone who had worked directly with the implicated employees provided additional validation for the changes she was planning to implement. Jennifer's perspective would be valuable in designing performance metrics and evaluation processes that rewarded genuine achievement rather than creative reporting. As the day drew to a close, Alina found herself emotionally exhausted but professionally energized by the clarity that the crisis had brought to her leadership role.
The misconduct revelations had been painful to address, but they had also removed the primary sources of resistance to operational improvements and cultural change. The staff members who remained were either genuinely committed to ethical practices or had received a powerful demonstration of the consequences of misconduct. The plastic trophy on her desk seemed even more symbolic now, representing not just her colleagues' initial misjudgment of her potential, but the deeper failure of a system that had valued appearance over substance, politics over performance, and short-term gains over sustainable success. The merger and her unexpected promotion had created an opportunity to build something better, and the day's events had cleared away many of the obstacles that might have prevented that transformation. But as she prepared to leave the office, Alina was also aware that the hardest work lay ahead. Removing problematic employees was relatively straightforward compared to the challenge of rebuilding trust, implementing new systems, and creating a culture that genuinely valued ethical behavior and operational excellence. The success of the merger and the future of the Pacific Division would depend not just on her analytical skills or crisis management abilities, but on her capacity to inspire positive change in people who were still processing the shock of discovering how extensively they had been misled by their former colleagues. The revelation phase was complete, but the recognition of what needed to be rebuilt was just beginning. Section 5. Transformation and Resolution. 3 months after the crisis that had reshaped the Pacific Division, Alina stood once again in the executive conference room where her journey had begun, but this time she was the one presenting quarterly results to Richard Hawthorne and the Meridian leadership team. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows illuminated charts and graphs that told a story of transformation that even she had not fully anticipated when she first accepted the regional director position. The numbers were compelling in their clarity. Client retention rates had improved by 37%, operational efficiency metrics had exceeded projections by 15%, and employee satisfaction scores had reached their highest levels in the division's history. But more important than the statistics were the systemic changes they represented, a fundamental shift from a culture of performance theater to one of sustainable excellence.
Ms. Chen, Hawthorne said as she concluded her presentation, these results exceed our most optimistic projections for the merger integration, but I'm particularly interested in the cultural transformation you've achieved. How did you manage to rebuild trust and morale after such a significant crisis? The question touched on what Alina had come to understand was the most challenging aspect of leadership, not just solving operational problems, but inspiring people to embrace change as an opportunity rather than a threat. The process had required skills she hadn't known she possessed, and had taught her lessons about human nature that no amount of analytical training could have provided. The key, she replied, was recognizing that most people want to do good work when they're given the tools and support to succeed. The previous culture had created artificial barriers to excellence, forcing employees to choose between ethical behavior and career advancement. Once we removed those barriers and aligned individual success with organizational integrity, the transformation was almost inevitable. The explanation was accurate but incomplete, glossing over the months of difficult conversations, policy implementations, and relationship rebuilding that had made the cultural shift possible. The real story was more complex and more personal, involving her own growth from an analyst who preferred working with numbers to a leader who had learned to work effectively with people. The transformation had begun with a systematic review of every client contract in the Pacific Division, a process that revealed the full extent of the problems Marcus, David, and Sarah had created through their misconduct. 17 major client relationships required complete renegotiation, with Alina personally conducting meetings to explain the situation and propose revised terms based on realistic service capabilities and transparent pricing structures. The conversations had been challenging, requiring her to acknowledge past failures while demonstrating the division's commitment to ethical practices and reliable service delivery. Several clients had terminated their contracts, unwilling to accept the higher prices that reflected actual service costs rather than the artificially low rates that had been subsidized through corners cut elsewhere. But the majority had chosen to continue their relationships, expressing appreciation for the honesty and professionalism that the previous management team had lacked.
Patricia Flores had emerged as a crucial ally in this process, her deep understanding of client service operations complementing Alina's analytical approach to relationship management. Together, they had developed new protocols for client communication that emphasized transparency and realistic expectations, creating a foundation for relationships that could withstand the inevitable challenges of complex business operations. Patricia's insight was invaluable, Alina had told Hawthorne during one of their weekly transition meetings. She understood that sustainable client relationships require trust, and trust requires consistency between what we promise and what we deliver. The previous approach of overpromising and scrambling to meet unrealistic commitments was exhausting for staff and ultimately disappointing for clients. The staff restructuring that followed the resignations had been handled with careful attention to both operational needs and individual career development. Jennifer Walsh had been promoted to senior account manager, her experience with client relationship management proving invaluable in the transition process. 2 external hires had been brought in to replace the departed senior staff, both chosen for their track records of ethical leadership and operational excellence, rather than their ability to generate impressive short-term results. The new performance evaluation system that Alina implemented represented a fundamental departure from the metrics that had previously driven behavior in the division. Instead of focusing primarily on revenue generation and client acquisition, the new framework included measures of client satisfaction, ethical compliance, operational efficiency, and team collaboration. Bonuses and advancement opportunities were tied to achieving balanced success across all categories rather than excelling in just one area.
The old system created perverse incentives, Alina had explained to the staff during the rollout of the new evaluation criteria. When people are rewarded primarily for short-term gains, they make decisions that optimize for immediate results rather than sustainable success. Our new approach recognizes that genuine achievement requires balancing multiple objectives and building systems that work over time. The response from staff had been overwhelmingly positive, with several employees expressing relief that their daily work could finally align with their professional values. The constant pressure to cut corners and inflate results had been replaced by support for thorough, ethical approaches to client service and business development. Training and development programs had been expanded significantly, with the budget previously misallocated to Sarah's visibility projects redirected towards skills development that would benefit both individual careers and organizational performance. Workshops on ethical decision-making, advanced analytical techniques, and collaborative leadership had been implemented, creating opportunities for staff to grow professionally while contributing to the division's improvement. The changes had not been universally welcomed. 2 additional employees had resigned during the transition period, expressing frustration with what they characterized as bureaucratic obstacles to aggressive business development. But their departures had been voluntary and amicable, representing a natural selection process that aligned the staff with the new cultural direction, rather than creating additional conflict or resistance. 6 weeks into the transition, Alina had received an unexpected visit from Marcus Webb, who had requested a brief meeting to discuss the possibility of providing consulting services to help with client transition issues. The conversation had been awkward but illuminating, revealing both his genuine regret about his past misconduct and his continued misunderstanding of what had gone wrong. "I made mistakes, but I was always trying to help the company succeed. Maybe my methods weren't perfect, but the results spoke for themselves. The division was profitable under my management." The statement had crystallized Alina's understanding of the philosophical divide that had made the previous culture unsustainable. Marcus continued to view success in terms of immediate financial results rather than the broader ecosystem of relationships, systems, and ethical practices that supported long-term viability. His results had been achieved through practices that undermined the foundation on which genuine success depended. "Marcus, profitability that comes at the expense of client trust, staff morale, and operational integrity isn't sustainable success. It's borrowed time. The problems we're fixing now were the inevitable consequences of prioritizing short-term gains over long-term viability." The meeting had ended cordially, but without any agreement about consulting services, representing a final closure to the previous chapter of the division's history and Alina's own professional development.
The most personally significant moment of the transformation had come during the division's quarterly team meeting when Jennifer Walsh had presented Alina with a new trophy to replace the Most Likely to Be Fired award that still occupied a place of honor on her desk. The new trophy, purchased collectively by the division staff, was engraved with the words, "Most likely to succeed, and take everyone with her." The ceremony had been informal and spontaneous, but the sentiment behind it represented a profound shift in how her colleagues viewed both her leadership and their own roles in the organization's success. The trophy was still made of cheap plastic with gold paint that would probably chip over time, but it symbolized something much more valuable: recognition based on actual performance rather than political positioning or superficial impressions. When I started in this role, Alina had said in her brief acceptance remarks, "I thought leadership was about having the right answers, but I've learned that it's really about creating an environment where everyone can contribute their best answers to the challenges we face together. This award belongs to all of us because our success has been a collective achievement."
The comment had been genuine, but it also served a strategic purpose, reinforcing the collaborative culture that had become the foundation of the division's improved performance. By sharing credit for achievements, Alina was encouraging continued participation in the improvement process, while demonstrating that leadership could be both effective and humble. The broader implications of the Pacific Division's transformation had not gone unnoticed within the merged organization. Hawthorne had begun using Alina's approach as a model for integration processes in other regions, and she had been asked to present her methodology to senior leadership teams across the company. The woman who had once been voted most likely to be fired had become a case study in successful change management and ethical leadership. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come from an unexpected source: her mother, who had visited Seattle the previous month to see Alina's new office and meet some of her colleagues. Margaret Chen, who had spent decades working in healthcare environments where excellence was measured by patient outcomes rather than political maneuvering, had offered a perspective that captured the essence of what her daughter had accomplished. "You've found a way to make doing the right thing also be the smart thing," she had said during a quiet dinner conversation. "That's not easy in business, but it's how you build something that lasts." The observation had resonated with Alina because it captured the integration of values and strategy that had made the transformation possible. The ethical approach to client relationships and staff management wasn't just morally superior to the previous culture, it was also more effective at achieving the sustainable success that the merger had been designed to create. As she prepared to leave the conference room after her presentation to Hawthorne and the leadership team, Alina reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 18 months ago, she had been a competent analyst whose contributions were valued but whose potential was underestimated by colleagues who mistook visibility for capability. The corporate retreat award ceremony that had seemed a humiliating acknowledgement of her peripheral status had actually been the beginning of a process that revealed the limitations of their evaluation criteria rather than her own professional limitations. The merger announcement that had initially seemed like an accident of timing had proven to be the result of a comprehensive evaluation process that recognized qualities her previous colleagues had overlooked: her methodical approach to analysis, her commitment to ethical practices, and her focus on sustainable systems had impressed decision-makers who understood the difference between performance theater and actual performance. But the real transformation had been personal rather than professional. The quiet analyst who had accepted other people's assessments of her potential had evolved into a confident leader who understood that genuine authority came from competence and integrity rather than political maneuvering and self-promotion. The journey had required her to develop skills she hadn't known she needed, from crisis management to inspirational communication to the delicate art of rebuilding trust after betrayal. The plastic trophy on her desk, both the original Most Likely to Be Fired award and its replacement, served as daily reminders of how dramatically circumstances could change when underlying assumptions were challenged by changing criteria for success.
Her colleagues had voted based on their understanding of what the company valued, but their understanding was incomplete. The merger had revealed that different qualities were actually more important, and those qualities had been present all along in someone they had dismissed as a supporting player in their career narratives. Walking back to her office through the corridors of the 15th floor, Alina noticed changes that reflected the broader transformation of the division's culture. Conversations were more collaborative and less guarded, with staff members sharing information and resources rather than hoarding them for competitive advantage. The artificial urgency that had previously characterized every project had been replaced by a focus on sustainable pace and quality outcomes. People seemed more relaxed, but also more engaged, freed from the constant pressure to manipulate appearances rather than improve results.
Her corner office, which had once felt like a sanctuary from office politics, now felt like a hub of genuine collaboration. Staff members visited regularly to discuss projects and share insights, creating the kind of open communication that had been impossible under the previous culture of competition and mistrust. The door was usually open, literally and figuratively, symbolizing an approach to leadership that emphasized accessibility and transparency. The succulent plant on her desk had not just survived, but thrived under her improved attention, its green leaves and new growth serving as a metaphor for what happened when systems received the care and attention they needed to flourish. The plant's resilience reminded her that both organizations and individuals could recover from neglect and grow beyond their apparent limitations when given proper support and realistic expectations. As she settled into her chair for the afternoon's scheduled meetings, Alina allowed herself a moment of satisfaction about what had been accomplished while remaining focused on the challenges that lay ahead. The transformation of the Pacific Division was a significant achievement, but it was also the foundation for larger opportunities within the merged organization. Hawthorne's requests for her to share her methodology with other regional leaders suggested that her approach could have implications far beyond the immediate scope of her current responsibilities. The ultimate measure of success would not be the quarterly reports or performance metrics, impressive as they were, but the sustainability of the changes over time. Creating a culture of ethical excellence was more difficult than implementing new policies or replacing problematic personnel, requiring ongoing attention to the systems and incentives that shaped daily decision-making throughout the organization. But as she reviewed her calendar for the coming weeks, meetings with clients who were expanding their contracts, presentations to industry conferences about sustainable business practices, interviews with potential new hires who were attracted by the division's reputation for ethical leadership, Alina felt confident that the transformation was becoming self-reinforcing rather than dependent on her personal oversight. The woman who had been voted most likely to be fired had not just survived the merger that was supposed to claim her job, she had used it as an opportunity to demonstrate that success could be achieved through competence and integrity rather than political maneuvering and ethical compromise. In the process, she had discovered capabilities she hadn't known she possessed and had learned that leadership was not just about having the right answers, but about creating environments where everyone could contribute their best solutions to shared challenges. The plastic trophy still sat on her desk, no longer a symbol of limitation, but a reminder of transformation, both personal and organizational. It represented the distance traveled from a culture that valued appearance over substance to one that recognized authentic achievement. And it served as a daily reminder that the most profound changes often began with someone having the courage to question fundamental assumptions about what success really looked like. The merger announcement had made her their new boss, but the real victory was more significant than any title or organizational chart could capture. She had proven to herself and others that sustainable success came from building systems, relationships, and cultures that could thrive over time, rather than merely generate impressive short-term results.
And in doing so, she had transformed not just a regional division, but her own understanding of what leadership could accomplish when it was grounded in competence, integrity, and genuine concern for the success of everyone involved. The afternoon meetings awaited, but they no longer felt overwhelming. They represented opportunities to continue building something that would last, something that would serve clients, staff, and stakeholders better than what had come before. The quiet analyst had become a confident leader, not through political maneuvering or self-promotion, but through the patient work of understanding systems and helping them function better for everyone involved. In the end, that had been the real lesson of her unexpected journey from most likely to be fired to regional director, that genuine success was not a zero-sum competition where one person's advancement came at others' expense, but a collaborative process where everyone could benefit when systems were designed to reward the right behaviors and support sustainable excellence.
The transformation was complete, but the work continued. And for the first time in her career, Alina Chen looked forward to that work not as an obligation to be endured, but as an opportunity to build something meaningful that would outlast any individual career or quarterly report. Thank you for listening to Most Likely to Be Fired, the story of Alina Chen's unexpected transformation from overlooked analyst to successful regional director. If you enjoyed this tale of corporate underdog triumph and want to hear more stories about workplace dynamics, leadership challenges, and the surprising ways careers can transform, please consider subscribing to our podcast.